Welcome into the Charm City Birdwatch podcast. I'm your host, Jake McDonnell. We're here on Saturday. A bunch of things going on. The Orioles are getting blown out by the Yankees and blowing 8-run leads. Meanwhile, the Ravens are busy in Owings Mills drafting from Philadelphia, where the NFL draft is taking place. The Ravens seem to be done now. The draft is still going on. It's in the 6th round, and the Ravens are out of picks. They picked 7 players. One in each rounds 1 through 6, and then 2 picks in round 3. And then, the draft's not over yet. The Ravens already had their post-draft press conference wrap up. But just in case anything else happens, I have my iPad sitting next to me in case I get a notification saying the Ravens are trading back in. But as of now, the Ravens are done, and they have 7 new Ravens and players on the team, with 5 of them being defensive players. Joining me now is one of our correspondents here at Charm City Birdwatch, Tyler Feeser. You can follow him on Twitter at Tyler_Feeser, and of course you can follow Charm City Birdwatch on Twitter at CharmCityBW, and myself at JMcDonald95. So Tyler, we're still draft's not over yet, and of course undrafted free agents will be signed to the team, but with these 7 picks right now, how are you feeling overall?
I feel pretty good. I really like what they did the first 2 days. Obviously, the third day is kind of a crapshoot every year for every team. But we'll just have to see going forward how those guys that they took today. Usually the guys that they've taken the first 2 days are immediate contributors, and the guys that they take on the third day are usually just special teams contributors if they make the team at all. More so depth guys if they make the team. But I actually really liked what they did throughout the draft so far. Like you said, they're finished right now, but it is a possibility just heading into, I think there's about 3 or 4 more picks left in the 6th round right now. So we'll see if they decide to make a trade like they did a couple years ago to get back into the 7th round. I think that might be a slight possibility, but we'll have to wait and see.
And of course, we had all sorts of draft coverage on CharmCityBirdwatch.com. I stayed up Thursday night and Friday night covering all things draft related. And then Nolan did a great job today covering the draft. He's out, doing things at Shippensburg. He did a great job today. And of course, if anything else happens, be sure to follow us on Twitter for all updates. The way I'm feeling, I feel pretty good about this draft as well, especially on the defensive side of the ball, considering 5 out of 7 picks were defensive players. They lost up front. They lost Lawrence Guy and Timmy Jernigan. They signed Brandon Williams. They lost Zach Orr due to retirement, and they really made a focus and a point of emphasis this offseason in making some additions to the defense. And it started off all in the secondary with adding Tony Jefferson and adding Brandon Carr, and then drafting the cornerback Marlon Humphrey out of Alabama, who I think is going to be a solid pick. And then they, in the next few picks, they move up. They go outside linebacker Tyus Bowser, and they draft Tim Williams out of Alabama and Chris Wormley out of Michigan to help on the defensive line. But I really like what they did defensively, and people forget they have guys like Bronson Kafusi and guys like Carl Davis, draft picks, mid-round picks that have barely seen the field but are still with the team. And now the additions of all what they've added to the defense, really, I think it could be a top unit next year. This guy Humphrey could be a starter right off the bat. We'll have to see what happens, but he certainly is a top talent. The Ravens have a group of young pass rushers with Bowser and Williams, and then joining the likes of Zadarius Smith and Matt Judon with Terrell Suggs mentoring them. And I've also heard things about this Bowser kid being able to also play a little bit of inside as well. So really, with everything they've done, everything they've added in the offseason, this defense, on paper, could be a very, very good unit going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. They were, I believe it was, what was it, like the 7th best defense in the league last year, and they've done nothing but get better. Like you said, they made some major improvements through free agency. And then they obviously made an effort to address some needs through the draft with early picks, with great young guys, and then like you also mentioned about young guys that either really showed flashes last year, like Tavon Young, and other guys like Bronson Kafusi and Matt Judon, who saw the field either very little or not at all. They might have a top 5 defense for years to come with all these young guys, because looking back at last year, I mean, guys like Eluemunor, who's not on the team anymore and won't be on the team anymore, guys like Terrell Suggs, who may only have a year or two left, guys like Ladarius Webb, who might only have a year or two left, they are getting up there in age, and they are going to need to replace these guys. So they're making a conscious effort to get younger on the defense and to be able to stop the top flight offenses like Pittsburgh in the division, who you have to face twice a year. So, I mean, they're making the right moves, and I'm really happy with the way that the draft played out. And if people listen to the press conferences that they've made over the past 3 days, I really do believe, which they make these statements year in and year out after the draft, they don't go into the draft consciously trying to address a certain need. They truly do go with the best player available, and it just so happened that the best player available for the first, 4 picks were all defensive players, and it just so happened that it played into our exact needs, which in my opinion, couldn't have played out any better. So, I mean, you get the best player available and you fill your top needs on your team, and I really think at least in the first 2 days, they really, really hit a home run. And, I mean, you take the Tim Williams pick alone as your last pick in the second day. Some people graded him as a first-round talent alone. I mean, obviously he has some off-the-field issues, but you bring him into a locker room with guys like Eric Weddle and Joe Flacco, who don't have any character issues and can take him under their wing and teach him the ropes, and that are solid veterans. And, I mean, they might be able to get him on the right path. So I'm really, really loving this draft so far. So we'll just have to see, and hopefully they can continue to grow.
And I do want to talk about particularly the first-round draft pick, cornerback Marlon Humphrey out of Alabama. You know, a lot of people didn't like this pick originally when it was made at first. I didn't like it as much as I do now. I think that, you know, at the time they made the pick, there were more pressing needs on the roster, such as pass rusher that they filled, and such as a position like receiver that they didn't fill. But the reason why I love the fact that they took a cornerback in the first round was really, it speaks to not only the failures of drafting Matt Elam, the safety, a couple years ago out of Florida. It also speaks to, in the past few seasons when the Ravens have really struggled and they've blown big games, what was a major factor of those losses? It was the loss of Jimmy Smith. Jimmy Smith missed half of the 2014 season, and then the playoff run when Tom Brady and the Patriots, as I wrote last night, overcame 2 separate 14-point deficits to come back and beat the Ravens, large in part because Smith wasn't on the field. And then in big games last year, in games such as against the Cowboys and the Giants, and after he got hurt against the Patriots again in that Monday night game, you know, when all those big plays happened, who wasn't on the field? It was Jimmy Smith. So with the addition of Marlon Humphrey, who will hopefully be able to provide some depth and some quality piece in case Smith does go down again, and then with the addition of, you know, Tony Jefferson and Brandon Carr and having guys like Tavon Young all on the roster and bringing back Ladarius Webb, they are making it clear that if they are going to blow big games again, they do not want it to be because of the secondary. And I really do think that this could be one of the top units in the NFL next season, and they do have coverage now in case a guy like, you know, Jimmy Smith or Ladarius Webb goes down with a big injury.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at the first 2 days of the draft, and the NFL as a whole, they set a record for most defensive backs drafted in the first 3 rounds with 29. And it shows that you can never have too many defensive backs in the league now. I mean, it's a pass-happy league. And whether you have injury concerns in your secondary or not, you can never have too many corners. You can never have too many safeties. And like you said, the Ravens obviously do have injury concerns in their secondary. So, I mean, they're going to need even more corners and even more safeties. So, I mean, with Jimmy Smith's injury history, you're absolutely going to need more corners. You look at their top 4 corners now, and you're thinking, yeah, we're absolutely set. So if Jimmy does go down, they have 3 guys behind them that are more than capable of stepping in. And even behind those 4, I mean, you got a couple guys that can probably step in and be serviceable. I mean, you obviously don't want them seeing the field too often, but they can be serviceable. So, I know a lot of the complaints that I've heard from Ravens fans in particular was that they felt like there were better players on the board and that they may have reached. But you look at who the opinion of it was that they were reaching. I mean, you look at guys like Mike Mayock and Mel Kiper and Todd McShay, like that. Those are according to their rankings. Those aren't the guys that are making the calls, and those aren't the front office GMs and the owners and the head coaches and the scouts. They aren't true scouts. I mean, those are according to their rankings. So, I mean, according to Ozzie, he said that Humphrey was by far the best player on their board. So, according to the Ravens front office, he was an absolute steal. So there was no way that they were going anywhere else. So, I mean, in the Ravens' eyes, there was no way. There was no way that it was a bad pick. It was clear cut. There was no way that they were going anywhere. They weren't going to take another player. In my opinion, I mean, I like the pick from the beginning. The only other player that I would have been okay with them taking was Reuben Foster. But I mean, you saw how far he slipped down. He fell all the way down to 31. So they would have had the option. They might have been able to trade down a couple more spots and still been able to take him. But I mean, that would have filled a need. But he obviously has some shoulder injuries, and I believe he might have some character issues as well. But yeah, I was very happy from the beginning about the pick that they made. I mean, you have the opportunity to solidify a position. That's one less position you've got to worry about the rest of the way. So you look at Pittsburgh. I mean, their receiving core. I mean, they're one receiver away each year from solidifying that. If they take their receiver, that's one less position that they got to worry about through free agency and later on in the draft. If they take their receiver, they get that out of the way. Don't have to worry about receiver the rest of the way. They can address other needs. So the Ravens were able to do that with corner in the first round this year, and they didn't have to worry about taking another corner in a draft where corner was abundant and everybody else was taking corner after corner after corner. Like I said, there was a record number of corners and defensive backs taken. Everybody else was taking corners and safeties, and what was available for the Ravens? Pass rushers. Our pass rushers were stacked. So the Ravens were able to get some really, really good pass rushers. So I think it worked out perfectly for them.
And with all this being said, I don't want people to get me wrong that I'm not happy with this draft, because I am. But when I look at the Ravens roster now, there's a very, very glaring need, and that is obviously the wide receiver position, which we need to address. Going into the draft with Mike Wallace and Rashard Perryman being the top receivers on the roster, followed by the likes of Chris Moore, Michael Campanaro, those guys. I thought that the Ravens were going to take a receiver within the first 3 rounds at some point. That didn't happen, and it didn't end up happening at all. So with that being said, that is still very much the biggest need on the roster. And I go back to the Ravens end of the season press conference last season when, John Harbaugh, Eric DeCosta, Steve Bisciotti, Ozzie Newsome all sit down, and they talked about how much Joe Flacco needs to play better next season. And while I do believe Flacco does need to play better, and I think they do think that he needs to play better, they also made the fact that they need to do a better job of adding pieces around him, and that's been a common theme really ever since the Ravens won the Super Bowl a couple years ago. I believe the receiving core last year that had, guys like Steve Smith and Mike Wallace and then Rashard Perryman all together was probably the best unit they had, along with Kamar Aiken. But now they go into a year where, Wallace and Perryman are going to be their top two guys, and as the Ravens talked about adding pieces for Flacco to work with, aside from, giving him Danny Woodhead, they haven't given him any pieces at all. And we're talking about playmakers here. We're talking about, tight ends, wide receivers, and running backs. And the only offensive players that they took in the draft this year were on the offensive line. So going forward, we know it's not over yet. We know that they're not done adding yet, but it would be hard to envision them, being able to find a receiver, number one. They're definitely not going to find number one now. I've heard rumors of them bringing back a guy like Bolden, who is about 36, 37 now. But even then, they still haven't given Flacco weapons. And if we're talking about, giving Flacco weapons and having Mike Wallace and Perryman as his only, viable receivers, or I guess Wallace is the only proven wide receiver on that roster. I wouldn't even include Perryman in that conversation yet. But how much better can they expect Flacco to be if he doesn't have the weapons that they talked about adding?
So I have a very strong opinion about this one, and I'm on the complete opposite side as you. So I look at this one as, and I know that majority of Ravens fans have the same exact opinion as you do, Jake. So I look at this and I immediately think this is straight Baltimore sports fan opinion. I look at this and it's the same exact situation as Orioles fans and the pitching staff for the Orioles. So you hear fans screaming and yelling, oh, the Orioles need to go out and sign a pitcher, and then what do? They go out and sign Ubaldo, and they sign Giovanni Gallardo. And what happens? It comes back, and it slaps them right in the face, and then everybody complains about it. Here we have the Ravens, and everybody says, oh, the Ravens need to go out and draft a receiver early. And what do? They go and draft Mark Clayton. They go and draft Rashad Perryman, and what do? It comes back and slaps them right in the face. So I don't think. I mean, obviously, at times at some point it's going to have to change. They're going to have to hit on the receiver, but at the same time, you look at going into last season. What did everybody say about Flacco? Oh, this is the year. This is the year that Flacco is going to really turn it on. This is by far the most weapons that he's ever had around him. He's got he's got Pitta. He's got a really good running game. He's got Steve Smith. He's got Mike Wallace. He's got Rashad Perryman healthy. He's got all these other guys. And what did he do? He did absolutely nothing. It was probably one of his worst years ever pro. So I'm thinking you might as well go and address the defense. I mean, even though they didn't actively purposely do that, they addressed the defense. So you might as well try to recreate the 2000 Ravens defense and try and win and only give up 10 points a game, 12 points a game, and then try and get Flacco to score 12 points a game to win it. So, like you said, they still have guys like Anquan Bolden. Yeah, it's a short-term fix. You can go out and sign Anquan Bolden closer to camp because Bolden already said that he will not sign a deal until closer to camp. So you bring in a guy, hopefully, like Anquan Bolden for a year or two. Maybe bring in now, since we started the podcast right now, I don't know which receivers were drafted, but I do know that there were quite a few fairly highly rated receivers still on the board. Now, if some of them go undrafted, I guarantee you that the War Room will be on the phone with all of them trying to get them to come to Baltimore. And quite honestly, they'd be kind of stupid to not come to Baltimore for at least a tryout because, I mean, let's be honest, like we're talking about right now, the Ravens receiving core is not that good, and they'd have a fairly good chance of making the team in Baltimore if they're worth anything. So if they do go undrafted, they're going to bring in receivers, guys like Isaiah, drawing the blank on his last name, from Virginia Tech. Now, like I said, at this point now, they might be drafted or they might end up being drafted in the 7th round. But guys like Malachi Dupree, Noah Brown from Ohio State, those are just 3 names that are coming to my mind. There may be other ones. Katie Cannon from Baylor. Some of these guys, they are possibilities that the Ravens might even trade back into the 7th round for them if they really like them and they're falling. So, yeah, like I said, I mean, Flacco has been given every opportunity in years past and has been surrounded by weapons and has been unable to do anything with them previously. So, I mean, in my opinion, I mean, you obviously have to try to give him a surrounding cast, but at the same time, you also can't purposely overdraft people. So if in the first round, I mean, you had the top 3 receivers go off the board, you can't take a 3rd round receiver in the 2nd round just because you can get a receiver. You have to take the best player available, and you can't overdraft a guy just because of the need. You have to take a guy that's within the realm of possibility. You're not going to take a guy 50 spots ahead of where he's projected to go. So you have to take a guy according to how the board falls. So it just so happened that a receiver wasn't within where they were drafting. So I mean, like I said, I still think there's a possibility that they might trade back into the 7th round like they did for Campanaro a couple years ago. depending on who they do like. Now, those guys that I mean, they might not like any of them, and they might not trade in for any of them. So we'll just have to see. But yeah, that's my opinion on the whole matter. I mean, they're definitely going to bring in receivers, but they're not going to be they're not an organization to overdraft just because they're going to take the best player available. So.
Yeah, I understand, what you're saying completely. I look at it from the perspective of, a lot of people, the Ravens themselves probably know for them, themselves that Flacco isn't a top tier quarterback, even though they're paying him like one. So I mean, I know they address certain other needs. Like I said, I respect the fact that they went and built up the defense, especially, and roster as best they could. I was just surprised that, being that Flacco isn't a top level quarterback, that they didn't, try to get more playmakers. That's a word that we've kind of played around with the past couple of seasons, and a lot of experts in sports, people that cover the Ravens have said over and over again, this team lacks playmakers. This team doesn't have playmakers. Blah 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 blah. I wasn't more upset. I was just shocked that they didn't, draft like a running back or a tight end or a receiver, somebody to give Flacco, somebody to throw the ball to, somebody to hand the ball off to. But I can't say I disagree with anything you said. I do think that building up a defense is certainly respectable, because we know how successful teams are that are able to build a lights out defense. And you allude to the Ravens trying to recreate the 2000 Ravens defense, which is, I think, if they are trying to build a lights out defensive team, they should also keep in mind that it's not 2000 anymore, and it's not the defense isn't going to be able, just with the way the rules are, to be able to be the same unit that the Ravens were in 2000, although they might be able to have a really number one unit in the league. That's my big concern going forward. I'm sure I trust Ozzie when he says they're not done. I'm sure they'll do something maybe with such a offensively focused or defensively focused draft this year. Maybe they'll have a heavily offensive focused draft this year. I don't know. But I am glad that they took 2 offensive linemen, because one of the questions going into training camp is certainly going to be who's going to play the center position and who's going to take the right tackle position. So with that aspect, it was good to see them bring in some offensive linemen to get some bodies up there and maybe see who's going to be taking those roles going forward.
Yeah, and let's just get something straight here, like you alluded to. Neither one of us are saying that the Ravens are going to be the 2000 Ravens defense either. We're just saying that's the goal here, is because we're basically saying the Ravens are not going to have a really good offense. So the goal here is, whenever you don't have a really good offense, the goal is to have as good of a defense as what you possibly can have. So the ultimate goal, coming from a Ravens organization, the gold standard is the 2000 Ravens defense. So that is the goal here. So you can't get much better from a Ravens organization standpoint. But the ultimate goal is to get as good as the 2000 Ravens defense. So not saying that they're going to have as good of a defense as the 2000 Ravens defense, because they're probably not going to, but it doesn't hurt to set a goal and try and get that good. Also, like you talked about with the offensive line, don't be surprised if the Ravens go out and sign Nick Mangold here in the next couple of weeks to play center.
Yeah, that's also another thing to keep in mind, although that wouldn't be accomplishing the getting younger thing that they've talked about. The other thing with the receivers is, it did seem, I know there were other players on the board, but it did seem before the Ravens got up to draft, especially last night, that a lot of receivers were taken like right before they got on the clock. I know they probably wouldn't have minded having Juju Smith, who the Steelers ended up taking, and when that just happens, there's not really anything you can do about it. But it's still, they went and addressed other positions, but still going into training camp, I think we can both agree that receiver is definitely the biggest question mark, and I think all Ravens fans are interested to see how they plan on addressing that need going forward. So, any final thoughts on the draft before we move on to a quick Orioles discussion?
Sure. One thing I heard Ozzie say earlier this evening that I found really interesting was in last year's press conference after the draft, he was asked a question about who was going to be the starting inside linebacker after they didn't address the need through the draft. And he said, we're going to give every opportunity to the guys that are currently on the roster. And who ended up starting at inside linebacker besides C.J. Mosley last year? It ended up being Zach Orr, who was already on the roster, and he ended up leading the team in tackles and ended up having what probably should have been a Pro Bowl year. So let's not get too ahead of ourselves. Now, yes, it's probably unlikely that a Ravens receiver that is currently on the roster is going to have the equivalent of what Zach Orr had last year. But at the same time, let's kind of I personally hate saying this just because of how the last 2 years have gone, but let's see what Perryman can possibly do. Let's see what a guy like Chris Moore can do. Let's see what other guys on the roster can possibly do. But you're absolutely right. They are going to address the wide receiver position through free agency, through draft free agency, and possibly even a trade, because the Eagles went out and got, now this is just one example, the Eagles went out and got Alshon Jeffrey, they went out and got Torrey Smith, and they even drafted one or two receivers today, or this weekend. So they have guys like Nelson Aguilar, who the Ravens would never trade for. But a guy like Jordan Matthews, who I believe a couple of years ago the Ravens were interested in, don't be surprised if the Ravens try and make a move for Jordan Matthews. They have some receivers in Philly that might be out of a job that the Eagles might be willing to trade. So don't be surprised if the Ravens make a trade for a receiver here in the next couple of weeks or months. So that's also a possibility.
And I was thinking, especially on the defensive side, they have so many pieces that they would be probably willing to, with all the depth they have there, they probably will be willing to move. So I definitely think a trade is not out of the possibility. Once again, Tyler.
When it comes, sorry, Jake, I cut you off. And when it comes to this is just one example, like I alluded to earlier. But when it comes to Philly, like you said, with all the depth on the defensive side of the ball, that's exactly what Philly needs: defensive depth. So look for Philly. That would be my top guess when it comes to a trade partner. Philly has receivers. We need receivers. We have defensive depth. That's what Philly needs. So that would be my top guess when it comes to a trade partner. But there are other teams out there as well. Maybe San Diego. They did a lot for their receiving core this year, in this year's draft. So I think a trade might end up being a top possibility as well. So we'll have to see.
Tyler Feeser, once again, you can follow him on Twitter at Tyler_Feeser. You can follow us out on Twitter at CharmCityBW and myself at JMcDonald95. Just wanted to quickly touch on the Orioles before we wrap things up here. Been a rough weekend series. They lost, I believe the final score, I have to check again. I believe it was 12-2 today to the Yankees, and of course, or 12-4, sorry. And then they got beat. They were winning 9-1 last night and ended up losing 11-4. So certainly a lot of bad pitching. Ubaldo got rocked again today. Caleb Joseph hit a 2-run home run, which is his first RBI since September 11th of the 2015 season. So I think this team is pretty much what we expected so far. Lots of home runs, a lot of hot and cold offense, and a lot of pitching that was pretty consistent surprisingly consistent for the first couple weeks of the season, with Ubaldo and Miley being respectable and Bundy being excellent. But still, Kevin Gausman pitched better last night than he has in his first 4 starts, but still did too much damage. And guys in the bullpen are getting lit up, especially in the series with the Yankees. But maybe this just, we know they're not that strong of a road team, but maybe this series is just showing us how good the Yankees really are this season. And I believe they are very good, and with all the young talent they have, they certainly have a shot at the division. But just quickly, where are you at with the Orioles? Because I know I haven't had you on the podcast to talk about anything Orioles related in a while. So after I guess it's about been the first month of the season. Where do you stand?
Well, I haven't over the past 2 days. Actually, for the last week, I haven't been able to watch the Orioles at all. I've been on work travel at the beginning of this week, and then with the draft, I've been watching the draft and not the Orioles. But I've been able to watch probably about 95% of the games prior to that. Obviously, the offense has been struggling recently, and the pitching rotation has been basically exactly what we expected. Bullpen's been struggling, like you said. I think missing Britton is affecting the bullpen, because when Britton was out there I mean, they weren't exactly what they have been the past 2 or 3 years, but I mean, they were pretty solid. They just need Britton back. I think the fix for the rotation is going to be getting Tillman back. I mean, I don't want them. I'd rather suffer for another 2 weeks to assure Tillman is completely healthy coming back. I'd rather have a completely 100% healthy Tillman and have him for the rest of the season. So once they get Tillman back, I think they'll be able to bump Ubaldo out of the rotation, and that should help the rotation a lot. As for the offense, I mean, I think it's basically the same offense we've seen for the past 4 years. I mean, they'll go 3 weeks with being red hot, and then they'll go dormant for a week and a half or 2 weeks and only score 2 runs a game. So I mean, it's going to be through the first month. We've basically seen it's going to be a 3-team race, most likely at the end of the season. It's going to be Boston, New York, and Baltimore. I mean, I think New York is basically, when they're at home, they're going to be really, really tough to beat with the youngsters that they have up on the roster now and the short porch and right. On the road, they're not going to be as tough because they don't have the short porch and right. They're smart. I mean, they built the stadium the way that they did for a reason. I mean, they bring in the young guys that can hit all the home runs, and they did it the right way. I mean, so the last time that they came to Baltimore this season, I mean, the Orioles pretty much dominated them, and then we go up to New York, and look what happens. I mean, we're struggling at the plate, and they're red hot right now, and they're hitting the crap out of the ball. So I mean, if we're hitting better right now, it's a completely different series. I mean, we win the game last night. I mean, even though we had a good night at the plate last night, we win that game last night if we do a little bit, if we're hitting better at the plate, in my opinion, even though it was the bullpen that struggled. So, I mean, we'll have to see. I mean, so far we've played pretty well against Boston, I think. So, Toronto's obviously the bottom dwellers. We're just going to have to clean up against Toronto and continue to play well against the Rays and hope that Boston and New York struggle against Toronto and Tampa a little bit. So, I think it's basically the same team that we've had for the last 3, 4, 5 years. We'll just have to hope that they continue to stay healthy, especially with the rotation, and hope that Gosman can work out the kinks and get back to more so what we had with him near the end of last season than what we've had through the first month of this season.
The Orioles will wrap up their 3-game series in the Bronx with the Yankees tomorrow with Wade Miley going on the hill. And then on Monday, they go up to Boston for a 4-game series against the Red Sox. I believe Dylan Bundy's supposed to be on the hill, but that's not confirmed yet. And of course, that game, if you are out of market from Boston or Baltimore, will be on ESPN. So I should be able to watch that game here on Monday night. Tyler, was great to talk some draft with you. I know it's been a while since we've had you on the podcast, but it was good to talk about the Ravens and the Orioles once again with all these draft picks coming in, and we'll have to see how they address the wide receiver position in particular going forward. Again, you can follow Tyler on Twitter at Tyler_Feeser, and once again, you can follow me on Twitter at JMcDonald95. Check us out on social media at Facebook.com/CharmCityBirdwatch, CharmCityBirdwatch.com, and Twitter/CharmCityBW. And of course, you can subscribe to this podcast through either iTunes or SoundCloud. So Tyler, once again, thanks for coming on, and have a great rest of your weekend before going back to work on Monday.
Yeah, thanks for having me.